When you see a headline like this, it is designed to make you feel like you just witnessed a historic act of national defiance. A clean break. A bold declaration of independence. Canada stepping out from under the shadow of the United States and pivoting decisively toward the Indo-Pacific. It sounds dramatic, almost cinematic. But what most people miss is that beneath the spectacle of diplomatic tours and high-level meetings, there is a much deeper economic story unfolding. And that story is not just about national pride. It is about leverage, dependency, and the structure of global capitalism itself. On the surface, what officially happened appears straightforward. Public reporting suggests that Canada's leadership announced a major trade and financial mission across key Indo-Pacific economies, signaling an intention to diversify away from overwhelming reliance on the US market. The mainstream account frames this as a strategic recalibration in response to escalating trade tensions and threats of financial pressure from Washington. We are told this is about resilience, about hedging risk, about building alternative partnerships with Japan, India, and Australia. But that surface narrative is incomplete. Trade missions happen all the time. Countries constantly talk about diversification. What makes this moment different is the context of financial weaponization. When access to dollar clearing systems or cross-border financial plumbing is even hinted at as a tool of coercion, that is not a routine trade dispute. That is a signal that the global monetary hierarchy is being used as a political instrument. And when that happens, middle powers start asking a very uncomfortable question. What does sovereignty actually mean in a system where one currency anchors everything? To understand this, we need to zoom out. For decades, Canada has been deeply integrated into the American economic orbit. Supply chains, energy flows, auto manufacturing, agricultural exports, and financial markets are tightly interwoven. The US dollar functions as the backbone of global trade settlement. This arrangement has delivered stability and growth, but it has also created asymmetrical vulnerability. When one partner controls the dominant currency and the key clearing infrastructure, the other partner is structurally exposed. What we cannot know from the headline alone is the precise content of any proposed currency swaps, trade agreements, or settlement systems. But the pattern usually works like this. When countries feel exposed to dollar-based sanctions risk, they explore bilateral currency arrangements, regional payment systems, and long-term commodity contracts denominated in alternative currencies. The goal is not necessarily to dethrone the dollar overnight. That would be unrealistic. The goal is insulation, partial decoupling, optionality. Now ask yourself, who benefits from such a pivot, and who bears the cost? Large resource exporters may gain leverage by opening new long-term markets. Financial institutions may gain flexibility if they can route transactions through multiple clearing systems. Political leaders gain negotiating power by signaling that they have alternatives. But workers and communities face uncertainty. If trade flows shift abruptly, factories tied to US supply chains could be disrupted before new Asian demand fully materializes. Ports, rail lines, and infrastructure projects become geopolitical chess pieces rather than neutral economic assets. And here is where the power dimension becomes clear. When threats emerge around tariffs or financial access, they do not just reflect economic disagreement, they reflect a struggle over hierarchy. The dominant power expects alignment. The smaller but wealthy partner tests the limits of autonomy. What looks like a diplomatic tour is actually a stress test of the post-war economic order. The media framing often reduces this to personality clashes or nationalist rhetoric. It focuses on bold speeches, tense statements, or symbolic gestures. What it rarely asks is this: why is the global system designed in a way that makes diversification feel like rebellion? Why is access to financial plumbing so centralized that exploring alternatives appears radical? If Canada truly attempts to rewire a significant share of its trade toward Asia, even gradually, the ripple effects will be significant. Not because $600 billion can be replaced overnight. It cannot. but because the mere attempt signals to other US allies that hedging is possible. And once hedging becomes normalized, the architecture of dependency begins to loosen. So when you hear about an Indo-Pacific pivot, I want you to look past the travel itinerary. This is about bargaining power in a world where currency dominance and trade access are strategic weapons. It is about how middle powers navigate a system that rewards integration but punishes independence. And the real question is not whether this pivot succeeds perfectly. The real question is what it reveals about how fragile the existing order may actually be. As we keep watching this unfold, ask yourself, if economic alliances can be rebalanced this way, what does that mean for workers, for prices, for the stability we have taken for granted? And who ultimately gets to decide the rules of global trade? If you want to keep unpacking how class, power, and finance shape these headline moments, stay with me. Let's keep thinking through this together. Once you start looking at it through that structural lens, the story becomes less about a single country making a bold move, and more about how tightly the global economy is wound around a single center of gravity. For decades, the United States has not just been a large consumer market. It has been the anchor of liquidity, the guarantor of trade routes, the issuer of the reserve currency, and the ultimate backstop in moments of crisis. That architecture gives Washington extraordinary leverage, whether it chooses to use it quietly or aggressively. When public reporting suggests that threats were made around access to dollar clearing or punitive tariffs, that is not just diplomatic friction. That is a reminder of how concentrated financial power really is. Most cross-border trade is invoiced in dollars. Most large banks rely on correspondent relationships that run through US-regulated institutions. Even companies that never set foot in America often touch the dollar system indirectly. So when a country like Canada explores alternative settlement systems with Asian partners, what it is really exploring is partial escape from that choke point. Now, we need to be disciplined here. What we cannot know from the headline alone is how far any of these negotiations will actually go. Currency swap lines and commodity contracts outside the dollar framework sound dramatic, but they are technically complex and politically delicate. Japan, India, and Australia all have their own dependencies, their own security relationships, and their own exposure to US markets. None of them can casually sever ties with the dollar either. So the likely scenario is not a clean break. It is gradual diversification layered on top of existing structures. But even gradual diversification changes incentives. If long-term energy or mineral contracts begin to be priced in yen, rupees, or some basket arrangement, that slightly reduces dollar demand at the margins. If bilateral clearing systems are strengthened, that slightly reduces vulnerability to sanctions pressure. Individually, these shifts look small. Systemically, they signal that the monopoly is no longer unquestioned. Think about what this means in practical terms. Canada is heavily dependent on exporting raw materials and intermediate goods. The United States is heavily dependent on importing Canadian energy, uranium, metals, and agricultural products. This is not a one-sided relationship. Entire American states rely on Canadian demand and supply chains. If even a fraction of that trade is redirected, logistics networks, trucking routes, rail hubs, and manufacturing plants feel it almost immediately. And here is where ordinary people enter the picture. When governments engage in trade brinkmanship, corporations respond by adjusting investment plans. A car manufacturer unsure about tariff exposure may delay expansion. An energy firm unsure about pipeline access may hesitate to commit capital. Workers feel that hesitation as stalled hiring, frozen wages, or reduced overtime. None of that shows up in the headline about a diplomatic tour. But it is the lived experience of geopolitical tension translated into paychecks. We also need to follow the money. Large resource companies stand to gain if they can lock in long-term Asian demand at favorable terms. Financial institutions may gain new fee streams from facilitating alternative payment systems. Infrastructure developers benefit from building ports, liquefaction facilities, and mineral processing plants. At the same time, sectors deeply integrated with US supply chains may bear adjustment costs. Capital is mobile and strategic, labor is far less so. The media narrative tends to frame this as a test of national courage or strategic foresight. What it avoids asking is who absorbs the downside risk if the pivot underperforms. If export volumes do not ramp up as projected, if Asian demand fluctuates, if currency volatility complicates pricing, it will not be abstract capital that feels the strain first. It will be communities tied to single industries, workers whose skills are specialized, and households already navigating high living costs. So when you hear that this is a declaration of economic independence, I want you to hold two ideas at once. Yes, diversification can increase resilience, but it also redistributes risk. And in capitalist economies, risk is rarely distributed evenly. The question is not just whether Canada can reduce its dependence on the United States. The deeper question is who inside Canada gains bargaining power from that shift, and who becomes more exposed during the transition.